The silence is the first thing I notice. Not an ordinary quiet, but a dense, woolen hush that swallows sound whole. The old grandfather clock in the hall, a metronome to my childhood, hasn't ticked for a decade, yet I feel its absence now. I came back to Blackwater House to sort through my father's things, to sell the decaying Gothic pile and its memories. But the house had other plans. It started with the keys. I'd leave them on the chipped porcelain dish by the front door. I'd find them later in the pocket of an old coat hanging in the attic, cold and slimy, with a residue that smelled of wet earth. Then it was the footsteps, not the frantic running of a rodent, but the slow, deliberate tread of a man with a heavy limp, pacing the upstairs landing every night at 3:17 a.m. I timed it. I'd lie rigid in my old bed, the one I outgrew at 16, and listen to the step drag. Step drag, pause outside my door. The floorboards there are warped. They creak under any weight. They remained silent. The rationalizations were thin, but I clung to them. Settling foundations, pipes, the wind through the rotten window frames. But the house wasn't settling. It was holding its breath. The pipes were frozen solid. There was no wind. I decided to document it. A sort of proof for myself, a way to exercise the creeping dread through logic. I bought a cheap digital voice recorder. On the third night of recording, I heard it. Over the white noise of the empty house, a wet, guttural whisper layered underneath my own sleeping breaths. It wasn't in English. It was a mangled, phonetic thing. I played it 100 times. I ran it through audio filters. The words, when they finally coalesced, were simple, under the red. For 2 days, I searched. Red rug in the study. Red paint flaking off the garden gate. My mother's long-discarded crimson shawl in a trunk. Nothing. The whisper came again on the 6th night, clearer, as if the source were closer to the recorder on my nightstand. Under the red stone, memory, then, a jagged shard. My father, a grim, silent man, pointing a calloused finger at the massive, moss-flecked hearth in the kitchen. A single brick at the lintel's center was a different shade of rusty, burnt ochre. Blood brick, he'd grunted once when I'd asked as a boy. From the old kill, don't ever touch it. A childish prohibition I'd long forgotten. The kitchen at night was a pit of shadows. The hearth was a gaping maw. I stood before it, a chisel and hammer in my trembling hands. The red brick was cold, colder than the others, sucking the heat from my fingers. The first tap was a tiny, sharp sound, lost in the hungry silence. The second cracked the mortar. On the third blow, the brick shifted inwards with a hollow, pneumatic sigh, like a lung collapsing. Behind it was not more wall, but darkness. A space I reached, in my hand numb, and my fingers brushed against something that was neither stone nor wood. It was leathery, yielding, and impossibly cold. I recoiled, but a compulsion, stronger than fear, pushed me back. I grabbed and pulled. It was a bundle, wrapped in oilcloth, blackened with age. Unfolding it on the scarred kitchen table, the only light a single swinging bulb, I saw it was a journal. Not my father's. The script was a tight, frantic cursive, the ink brown as old blood. The first entry was dated October 31st, 1888. Elias Blackwater, my great-grandfather. His words were not the musings of a gentleman farmer. They were the clinical notes of a man conducting an experiment. He wrote of quieting the land, of appeasing the deep clay. He wrote of rituals involving symbols carved into the foundations, and of a sacrifice of silence. The later entries grew disjointed, terrified. It is not enough. It asks for a voice. It learned the shape of a mouth from me. The final entry, a single scrawled line, stopped my heart. It wears James's face. It walks with his limp, but it is hollow. I have put my son in the earth, and something else is wearing his skin. It is learning. God, forgive me. It is in the walls. James, my father's stories of a sickly uncle who died young, a childhood illness, a lie seeded generations deep. As I read the last word, the bulb overhead died. Not with a pop, but a slow dimming into absolute black. The step drag sound began, not from upstairs, but from the hallway just outside the kitchen door, closer, heavy, deliberate. The smell of turned earth and rust bloomed in the air, thick enough to taste. I froze, a rabbit before a snake. The footsteps stopped at the threshold. The door, which I had closed, began to inch open, not with a swift push, but with a slow, relentless pressure grating against the floor. Moonlight from the high window sliced through the widening gap, illuminating a silhouette. It was the shape of a man, but wrong. The proportions were subtly off, the legs too long, the head slightly too large, cocked at an unnatural angle. It stood perfectly still, framed in the doorway. I could see no details, only a solid darkness, deeper than the room around it. Then it took a step inside. Step dash drag. Dot. My paralysis broke. I scrambled backward, knocking the chair over with a crash that seemed obscenely loud. I fumbled for the back door, my hands slick with sweat. The rusted bolt wouldn't budge. I threw my shoulder against it, once, twice, a sob tearing from my throat. Behind me, the thing was in the kitchen. I heard the scrape of a foot on the stone flags. I could feel its regard, a physical coldness on the back of my neck. The bolt shrieked and gave. I tumbled out into the freezing night, into the overgrown garden, and ran. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, down the overgrown drive, through the skeletal iron gates, and didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine screaming as I fled. I spent a week in a cheap motel, drinking, jumping at every sound. The journal sat on the nightstand, a cancerous lump. I read it over and over. Elias Blackwater had tried to bind something to the land, to make the soil yield greater harvests. He'd given it a silence, then a shape, then a name, and it had taken them, learned from them, and wanted more. It wanted a voice of its own. Last night, the motel room phone rang, a dead line, just static. But in the static, a pattern emerged, a step-drag rhythm. Then the whisper, now clear, resonant, as if spoken directly into the receiver. You left the door open. I drove back today. I had to. The front door of Blackwater House was indeed open, swaying gently on its hinges. Inside, everything was as I'd left it, yet profoundly different. A new silence reigned, a satisfied silence. The air was warm and close, smelling of loam and something metallic. My recorder was on the kitchen table. I played it. My own voice came out, but not words I'd spoken. It was me, my exact cadence and tone, speaking calmly, pleasantly. Hello, it said. It's much cozier now. Thank you for the use of the stone. The red one. It's a good mouthpiece. I looked at the hearth. The blood brick was back in place, seamless, as if it had never moved. But the mortar around it was fresh, dark, and damp. I touched it. It was warm, and under my fingertips I felt a faint, rhythmic pulse. It's getting dark now. I'm sitting in the study, writing this. The front door is locked, but I know that means nothing. The house isn't a structure anymore. It's a throat. I can hear it breathing, a low, tidal sound in the walls. The footsteps haven't returned. I think it's because it doesn't need to walk anymore. It's everywhere. It's in the grain of the wood, the chill of the glass, the very air I'm struggling to pull into my lungs. And it's learning faster now. An hour ago, the grandfather clock chimed. For the first time in 10 years, it chimed 3:17. The sound wasn't made of brass and pendulum. It was wet and guttural and familiar. It's almost time. I can feel the words forming in my chest, bubbling up like cold spring water, words I don't want to say, in a voice that is slowly becoming my own. It needs a voice to speak to the world, and I am here. I am under the red stone. The key is in the coat, in the attic. Come find it. Come listen. I have so much to say. The silence in the house was the first thing I noticed, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. It was past midnight, and the old Tudor on the outskirts of town creaked, as old houses do. I'd just moved in a desperate bid for affordable space to finish my dissertation. The realtor had been oddly brisk, the paperwork a blur of fast talking and quick signatures. "It's got character," she'd said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I'd chalked it up to a long day. That first peculiarity was easy to dismiss. I'd place my reading glasses on the bedside table and find them later on the mantelpiece. The book I'd left open on the sofa would be closed, a dry oak leaf marking a page I hadn't read. I blamed fatigue, the disorientation of a new place. My work suffered. Sentences blurred, my focus shattered by a constant, low-grade chill that the furnace couldn't seem to touch. Then came the whispers. Not voices, exactly. More like the faint, rhythmic rasp of someone turning a thick parchment page. It would come from the wall behind my desk, the one with the strangely patterned wallpaper faded design of interlocking lilies and thorns. I'd press my ear to it, hearing only the sigh of the wind. But the moment I stepped back, the turning would resume, slower, as if deliberate. Sleep became a fractured thing. I'd wake at 3:17 a.m. precisely, every night, my body rigid. The air would be frigid, smelling of damp soil and something metallic, like old ink. One such night, driven by a dread I couldn't name, I got up. The floorboards were ice under my bare feet. The whispering from the wall was louder, a susurrating chant. I followed it, not to the study, but to the small, neglected door at the end of the hallway I'd assumed was a closet. It was unlocked. The door swung inward without a sound, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into absolute blackness. The cold flowed up from it like water, and the whispering wasn't coming from behind the wall anymore. It was coming from down there. I closed the door, shoved a heavy chair against it, and spent the rest of the night trembling under my blankets, rationalizing an old root cellar, the wind in a pipe. But the house began to remember I was there. Objects didn't just move. They transformed. My favorite pen, a black fountain model, was found one morning dripping with a viscous, rust-colored fluid that smelled of copper and decay. The words I typed on my laptop would sometimes rearrange themselves into short, cryptic phrases in a language I didn't recognize, all sharp angles and coiled symbols. "He is hungry for the words," one line read, before my screen flickered and went black. The final thread of my sanity began to fray on a rain-lashed Tuesday. I'd been attempting to work, the whisper a constant backdrop. Frustrated, I slammed my fist on the desk. "Be quiet," I roared. The whispering stopped. The silence was immediate and total, more terrifying than the sound. For a full minute, there was nothing. Then, from the hallway, came 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cellar door. Knock, knock, knock. My blood froze. I sat paralyzed, staring at my closed study door. A minute later, 3 more knocks, this time on the study door itself. Something was out there, something that had heard me and had answered. I didn't sleep that night. I huddled in the corner of my bedroom, a kitchen knife in my hand, listening. The house was silent, but it was a watchful silence. I knew it was waiting for me to break at dawn. Desperate, I decided to investigate the cellar. I needed proof it was just a space, bricks and dirt, not a throat. Armed with a flashlight and a foolish bravado, I moved the chair and opened the door. The cold was a physical force. The stairs groaned as I descended into a smell of wet stone and age. It wasn't a root cellar. It was a library, or a tomb for books. Dust-laden shelves, carved from the same dark stone as the foundations, lined the walls, crammed with volumes bound in strange leathers and metals. In the center of the room stood a massive lectern, and upon it rested a single enormous book. Its cover was a dark, mottled hide, fastened with a clasp that looked like carved bone. The whispering was a chorus now, emanating from every book, but loudest from the large one. It was an invitation I shouldn't have approached. Every cell in my body screamed to run. But I was drawn, as a needle is drawn to a magnet. I had to see. I had to know. The pages were not paper, but a thin, fibrous parchment. The script was the same angular, coiling language that had appeared on my computer. But as I stared, the words began to shift, to translate themselves in my mind. It was a history, a ledger. It told of the house's first owner, Alistair Vane, a scholar of forgotten tongues. He hadn't just collected books. He had collected stories, not written once, the essence of them, the life and memory from which they sprang. The book detailed a ritual, the extraction of a narrator's essence, their very consciousness, to fuel a thing. A guardian of this forbidden knowledge. The book called it The Librarian. Vane had become its first victim, bound to the house, his soul the ink in these pages. The last entry was recent. It described a new resident, a doctoral student, drowning in words of his own. It described me, my frustration, my isolation, my ripe, bubbling fear. It ended with a phrase, "The offering is prepared." The binding commences. A dry, papery scrape sounded behind me. I turned, my flashlight beam shaking. It stood at the foot of the stairs, blocking my only exit. It was tall, its form suggesting a man in a long, tattered coat, but the coat seemed woven from shadows and crumbling parchment. Where a face should have been was a swirling vortex of loose, floating pages covered in that ceaseless, crawling script. In one long-fingered hand, it held a quill that glinted like a shard of obsidian. It didn't move. It just watched me with its page face rustling. I dropped the flashlight. It clattered on the stone, the beam spinning, casting lunatic shadows. I backed away until the lectern dug into my spine. The librarian tilted its head. The whispering focused into a single, clear sentence in my mind. A voice like the grating of tomb slabs. The narrative is incomplete. It glided forward, noiseless. I was frozen, not by magic, but by a terror so pure it locked my joints. The quill rose. It was not meant for paper. With a motion too fast to follow, it pierced the skin just over my heart. There was no pain, only a profound, wrenching cold. It began to write. I felt the pull, the siphon. Memories, thoughts, my own internal voice. They were being drawn out, translated into that vile script on its ever-turning pages. My childhood, my first love, the taste of fear, the texture of loneliness, all becoming words in its story. My essence, my very self, was being bound into the narrative of the house. I was becoming a character in its eternal, horrific tale. I don't know how I broke free. Perhaps my raw panic was a flavor it hadn't anticipated. I screamed, a wordless animal sound, and shoved against the lectern with all my weight. The great book thudded to the floor. The thing recoiled, a shriek of rustling paper filling the chamber. I didn't think. I ran, scrambling past it, up the stairs, through the house, and out into the weak morning light. I left everything: clothes, research, my sanity. I live in a bare apartment now, with plastic furniture and white walls. I keep the lights on day and night, but it's not over, because the binding, it worked. Just not completely. I am still here, in my body, in this rented room, but I am also there. A part of my consciousness remains in that stone cellar, bound to that book. I can feel it, a constant, cold thread tugging at my mind. When I close my eyes, I don't see darkness. I see the flicker of pages turning. I hear the perpetual whisper of my own stolen memories being read back to me. My thoughts are no longer entirely my own. Sometimes they come in that angular script, a foreign narration of my own life, and at 3:17 a.m. every single night, I am compelled to write. My hand moves on its own, scrawling lines in a language I now understand too well. It is adding to the story. It is finishing the narrative. Last night, I wrote this. The subject resides elsewhere, but the connection holds. The words are a conduit. The librarian is patient. It has his voice now. It will use it to call him back, or to call another. The house is hungry. The story must be fed. The pen is in my hand again. The page is empty. It's waiting. It's always waiting. The scratching started on a Tuesday, not the frantic skittering of a rat in the wall, but something slower, more deliberate, a dry, persistent scrape, like a single fingernail being dragged along the underside of the floorboards in the hall. It began each night at precisely 3:17 a.m., according to the red digital numerals of my bedside clock, and lasted for exactly 7 minutes. Then, silence. I am a rational man. I blamed the house, an old Victorian on the outskirts of a town that sunlight seemed to forget. Settling, I told myself. Old wood contracting in the night chill. I got a hammer and tightened every floorboard screw I could find from the basement ceiling. That night, the scratching was louder, angrier. It was no longer under the hall floor. It was under my bed. I didn't sleep. I lay frozen, the sound vibrating up through the mattress coils, into my spine. It felt intelligent, a cognizant abrasion. When it stopped at 3:24, the silence was thicker than before. A held breath. The next evening, I went down to the basement with a high-powered flashlight. The air was a damp cloak. I examined the joists and subfloor beneath my bedroom. Cobwebs, dust, a few mouse droppings, nothing unusual. Then the beam caught something on a concrete support column. Not a mark ID made. It was a symbol about the size of my hand, scratched into the gray concrete. It looked like a closed eye with too many lashes, or a sun with twisted rays. The lines were fresh, the concrete within them lighter. My hammer was on the workbench. I hadn't done this. I ran the back of my hand over it. The concrete was rough, cold. As I pulled my hand away, a sliver of it, sharp as a razor, dug into my knuckle. A single bead of welled up and fell, striking the dust at the base of the column with a dark, perfect dot. That night, the scratching didn't wait for 3:17. It began the moment I turned off the lights. And it wasn't under the bed anymore. It was on my bedroom door. From the inside, I watched, my throat sealed shut as the heavy oak door trembled in its frame. Scratch, scratch, drag. I could see it, a single, unseen nail tracing a slow, vertical line down the center panel. I fumbled for the lamp. Light flooded the room. The sound stopped. The door was still. On its painted surface, a faint, dusty line was visible, right where the scratching had been. I moved to the living room couch. It followed. The presence, it's hard to describe. It was a specific, localized cold, and a smell that surfaced only when you were perfectly still, like damp clay and old iron. It would manifest in a corner of a room, a pocket of air maybe 10 degrees colder than the rest. If you stood in it, the dread was overwhelming, a primal urge to flee screaming. It would linger for an hour, sometimes 2, then dissipate, only to reappear in another room. It was learning the house. Mapping it, I stopped going to the basement. The door at the top of the stairs felt like a membrane holding something back. But the thing was already upstairs, with me. The scratching became sporadic, abandoning its schedule. It would come from inside the fireplace flue, or from the back of the linen closet. Once, horrifyingly, from just beneath the cushion of the armchair I was sitting in. I began to see the marks. They were never there in full light, but in the half-gloom of dawn or dusk, I'd catch them. The same twisted die symbol, etched into the baseboard, the back of a cabinet door, the headboard of my bed. They were always shallow, as if made by something with immense patience, but little physical strength. I'd sand them away, paint over them. They'd return within a day, in the exact same spot. The new paint seemingly dissolved. My reflection started to change. It was subtle. In the bathroom mirror, my face would look tired, gaunt, which was understandable, given the sleep deprivation. But then I noticed a lag. I'd turn my head, and my reflection's eyes would linger on the spot I'd just been looking at for a fraction of a second too long. A grimace would take a heartbeat longer to fade from its mouth. It was catching up. One morning, shaving, I nicked my chin. A dot of blood appeared on my skin. In the mirror, the blood didn't trickle. It remained a perfect sphere, for a full 3 seconds before my reflection's hand rose to wipe it away. I was being replaced. Not my body, but my context. The thing was scratching its symbol into the fabric of my life, etching itself into the boundaries of my home, my reflection, my sense of reality. It was claiming territory. The final descent began on a night of no moon. The cold spot had settled in the center of the kitchen and wouldn't move. The air was frigid, paralyzing. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door, a pathetic gesture. The scratching began immediately, not on the door, on the wall above my headboard. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Then a new sound, a whisper. It wasn't auditory. It was inside my skull, a thought that wasn't mine, shaped from broken glass and static. See, the scratching on the wall became furious. Plaster dust sifted down onto my pillow. I couldn't move. The digital clock bled from 3:17 to 3:18. See, with a final grating scrape, a piece of the wall gave way. A small hole, no larger than a coin, opened in the plaster. Beyond it was not the lathe and insulation of the interior wall. It was black, a pure, depthless, velvety black, and from that blackness, an eye pressed against the hole. It was human in shape only. The iris was the color of tarnished silver, shot through with thin, black veins. The sclera wasn't white, but a dirty yellow-gray. It didn't blink. It simply stared, unblinking, into the room, into me. The intelligence in that gaze was ancient and utterly hollow. It was the thing that had been scratching. It had finally broken through. The whisper in my mind congealed into a single, clear sentence. I am the warden. You are the wall. I understood then. This wasn't a haunting. It was an incarceration. The house wasn't my home. It was a prison cell. And I wasn't the inhabitant. I was part of the architecture. A living, breathing layer of mortar and brick meant to contain what was in that blackness. The scratching, was it trying to wear me away, to thin the wall until it could see out, until it could get out? The eye receded into the black. The hole remained. The cold spot vanished from the kitchen. The oppressive feeling lifted, replaced by something worse, a dreadful, silent observation. I was being watched from that hole in the wall, constantly. I tried to seal it. I stuffed it with steel wool, packed it with quick-dry cement. The materials didn't disappear. They simply turned to a fine, gray dust by morning, sifting out onto my bedspread, leaving the hole open. I hung a painting over it. The next day, the painting was on the floor, face down, and the glass was cracked in a pattern that perfectly mimicked the twisted die symbol. I am writing this from the living room. It is 3:16 a.m. The scratching has stopped for good. It doesn't need to scratch anymore. It has a view. The hole has grown. It's now the size of a dinner plate. The blackness beyond is absolute. Sometimes the eye fills it. Sometimes other things press against the opening, the pale, segmented curve of something that might be a finger, the wet, matted strands of what could be hair. Once, the terrible, lipless rim of a mouth that exhaled a breath smelling of turned earth and static, directly into my bedroom. The whisper is constant now. It doesn't form words, just a ceaseless, droning pressure at the base of my skull, telling me my purpose. Warden, wall, contain. I can't leave. I tried. I got as far as the front walk before the psychic recoil hit me. A wave of nausea and bone-deep terror, so profound I vomited and crawled back to the porch on my hands and knees. The house is my flesh. The thing in the wall is my prisoner. And a warden can never abandon his post. Last night, a new message slithered into my mind as I stared, sleepless, at the growing void in my wall. The wall thins. The warden sleeps. I wake. It's true. I am thinning. I can see it in the mirror. My reflection is now a full second behind. My hands look translucent in certain light. I forget to eat. My own memories feel like stories I read about someone else. I am becoming a ghost, a binding spirit, a layer of insulation. Soon, I will be too thin to hold it, and when I am gone, when the last of my consciousness erodes into that whispering static, the wall will cease to be, the hole will become a door, and the thing with the tarnished silver eye will step out into a world that has long forgotten the need for walls like mine. It will scratch its symbol not on concrete or wood, but on the sky itself. The clock just turned to 3:17. A long, pale finger, too many joints, is slowly tracing the rim of the hole from the other side. Testing the edge, it's almost time.